Sustainability plays a huge role in the preservation of historic and non-historic buildings. And ultimately, it's not just about the preservation of said buildings, but also the preservation of the environment and the planet we live on.
By preserving the project, we're already reducing embodied energy as a whole, but a piece of that's the operational. So if you have an old building that leaks, that's got inefficient systems, that has lighting from like the 1980s or earlier, right? And you improve all of those systems, then you're really going to reduce that operational carbon, by a lot.
Welcome back to What's the Scope with Finegold Alexander Architects, the podcast where we share our hands-on approach to projects and how we love to celebrate design that is boundless. I'm Madison Mercado, your host and a marketing coordinator at the firm. If you haven't listened to the first episode, I highly recommend checking it out to learn more about our firm and the type of work that we do. Today, we're continuing our mini-series for Preservation Month with a conversation with two of our sustainability leaders.
I'm Rebecca Berry, principal at Finegold Alexander Architects, and I'm the director of our FI Energy program, which we're going to talk about today. I suppose something that everybody should know about me, perhaps related to sustainability, is that I am an incredibly avid skier and I love snow. And I am a big supporter of Protect Our Winters, which is an initiative that it was started actually by the outdoor sort of winter sporting community to do exactly what it says, to try to protect our winters.
Hi, I'm Megan Brown. I'm an architect and I manage our FA Energy practice here at Finegold Alexander Architects. I am most passionate about decarbonization work, envelopes, and building science. I am also an avid runner, and I guess a big part of the reason that I do the work I do in decarbonization is to help preserve the natural world.
Love it. So we're here to talk about Preservation Month and preservation in general. And Finegold Alexander as a firm has done quite a bit of these historical preservation projects in the past and the present of the firm itself. When you join and then maybe eventually work on some of these projects, what draws you to doing preservation as opposed to like new construction or other projects like that?
So from an architectural problem solving standpoint, I find existing buildings absolutely fascinating. You can, when you're in architecture school, I think people often hand you like a blank piece of paper, but the world kind of doesn't work that way. We all live within our context. We all live within our culture, our environment. And so what's kind of interesting about a preservation project is often at least part of your scope is defined, right? You're going to be working with an existing context. And really specifically, a lot of times, even within existing layouts, where are the stairs? Where is the fenestration? Where is the detailing that's important to preserve? What is the volume of the building and how can you fit a new program within that? So it's, in my mind, it's really interesting because you're constantly solving a kind of a three-dimensional puzzle, or you are solving a problem which already has a whole series of constraints that you've been given. And so in some ways, I really find that I just enjoy that kind of challenge in a way that's very different from like the challenge of having a blank slate and starting with a new building.
Yeah, I think in architecture school, when we talk about theory, I was always drawn to things that were like place-based architecture, and existing buildings kind of have that embedded already in them. You're not creating something that's of a place because it's already part of the community that it's in. From an envelope perspective, I love existing buildings because it's almost like we get to be a detective and analyze, what's working, what's not, where are the issues. Again, working through all of those challenges and seeing how we can make it better.
When you approach a preservation project, what are some of the aspects of a building that you can tell will enable it to last another 100 years, for example, before it needs to be restored again?
It's an interesting question. Really, you're going to start with the envelope, right? You're going to start with those elements of the building that provide the enclosure and then provide shelter, right, to the people who use the building. Because that envelope is what is critical in terms of housing the building functions, in terms of providing space for mechanical systems, in terms of how it performs keeping water out, how it performs from an energy standpoint. That's what FA Energy is really all about, is that question of, how can we help decarbonize that building? So preservation-wise, you really have to start there. Now, that's critical from an energy standpoint, also, of course, from preserving a cultural resource. But additionally, I think it's important to note that a lot of our preservation projects don't necessarily fit neatly into the sort of old school definition of preservation, right? We have aspects of preservation, we have aspects of rehabilitation, aspects of restoration. We often have additions on these projects, right? So we're combining different approaches to maybe different parts of the program or different current needs of the community, right, within that building. But the energy piece really kind of touches on that envelope. So from sort of the perspective of decarbonization and preservation, the envelope is absolutely critical to a successful project.
Yeah, we stress envelope first approach all the time. These mechanical systems, the active systems we might call them, they'll get replaced every 20, 30 years. But the envelope, the walls, the windows, ideally we're not touching those for decades, many decades. The brick on an existing building could be 100 years old and still function the way it was designed. So we like to look at the passive systems, the things that just sit there, your walls, your insulation, they just sit there, and they do a lot of the work. They're doing the heavy lifting, basically, of creating the environment that we want for people inside.
Yeah, and by taking those systems, which, to Megan's point, maybe 100, 150, how old's the oldest part of the Bullfinch building at the State House? Are we at?
Built in the 1700s.
Yeah.
It's coming up on its 250th anniversary.
Exactly. So really old technologies, right? That we're dealing with. And so we're analyzing, to Megan's point, we're starting with that envelope and analyzing those and determining what we need to do to take those systems and bring them kind of into this century as best we can, right, from a performance standpoint, while not damaging the systems, right? Careful analysis of the masonry, but also in a way that usually what we're trying to do is with those systems, we're not trying to leave fingerprints, right? We don't want people to necessarily know that we've been there. So it's sort of an interesting standpoint to be from an architect, right? Is when we're done, no one's necessarily going to know what we did at the edges of the windows or what we did to preserve the masonry, right? We want it to look kind of seamless with, the building that was there originally, at least with the type of building like the Bullfinch building. Yeah, a truly historic building versus, say, an existing building, which is important and has important functions, but doesn't have sort of cultural significance of some of the larger projects that we work on.
Do you ever come across projects where it does seem well, this building isn't historic, it's just an existing building, where you might approach it differently than a historic building because it doesn't have cultural significance, or maybe there isn't a big community rallying for it to stay the way it is?
I think, yeah, you could approach it differently.
It might give you a little bit more flexibility, I
Yeah.
guess, on what you could do, maybe how robust you could make the walls as far as performing, adding layers right to the assembly to make it perform better. You might not have that flexibility on a very historic building.
Yeah. When we did the study for the elementary school in Spofford Pond, right, we actually looked at potentially what we call overcladding, putting a whole new exterior, insulated panel system on the building, because it was a simple building, it wasn't historically significant. So changing the whole appearance of the exterior was up for grabs, right? It was okay. We could do that as a way of improving the building.
Nice. Kind of switching gears to more questions about sustainability. Are there different types of preservation projects that lend themselves more to putting a more FA energy spin on them rather than just restoring and doing any sort of historical preservation work, where you're actually looking at a decarb plan, or really looking at how energy efficient this building will be while keeping it in its original form to the best of your ability?
So I think one of the big sea changes that we frankly had, at least here in New England and specifically in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, is a real leap forward on energy codes and a commitment by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to have a zero carbon goal, right? So we're trying to decarbonize by a certain date. And so when like those kind of large goals are put out there, then that sort of changes like the whole thought bubble when you start a project, right? Because you're going to say, okay, within this historic building or this existing building, what are the different approaches that we can take that will both preserve the building, but also, by the way, we're trying to get to a goal of reducing the operational energy, right? Mm-hmm. By preserving the project, we're already reducing the embodied energy.
Yes.
As a whole, but a piece of that's the operational. So if you have an old building that leaks, that's got inefficient systems, that has lighting from like the 1980s or earlier, right? And you improve all of those systems, then you're really going to reduce that operational carbon, by a lot. But the way that you keep the whole embodied energy low is by, say, reusing as much of the structure as possible, right? Like removing as little as possible, putting as little possible in the landfill, even like when you renovate the building, right?
Mm-hmm. We want to talk a little bit about reducing operational carbon and the challenges and opportunities that go with that. So do preservation projects actually make a building more sustainable in the end?
Great question. Ideally, right? That's always the goal. I think, so we like to start by analyzing it for sort of these like low-hanging fruit options and then work our way up to larger changes and incentives on the project. Often those low-hanging fruit is air infiltration on existing buildings, even like especially historic ones, because that is something that you can usually change, right? You can add air sealants and you can add weather stripping. They're things that people don't see. Doesn't make a big aesthetic difference, but reducing the air infiltration, the leakiness of the building can really drive operational energy needs down and reduce the load. So that's always the first place we look, I would say, is air infiltration.
Yeah, and like you said, it's another one of these things like you don't leave the fingerprints, right? Like you don't really notice it. Mm-hmm. And then also, after that, right, then we say like, okay, are there places that we can insulate, right? That we can move the needle, right, on the envelope, like the sort of general envelope performance of the building. And yes, it does. It absolutely makes the building more sustainable as you go through these analyses of, to Megan's point, like step 1, keep the air out. Step 2, what about the insulation? Step 3, coordinate with your mechanical engineers, right, on the sizing of your systems, because then you can get systems that are right-sized, so you're not putting more air in the building than you need or using more, say, water for heating and cooling than you need, because you've really tried to get the envelope, performing the way that you need it to for the occupants inside too. And it helps with occupant comfort too, which, that's a whole other aspect of sustainability, right, is creating a healthy environment for the folks who are in the building. Most of these older buildings, they rely on opening windows, right, on like a hot day or whatever. They probably don't have good air filtration systems. Mm-hmm. They are often environments where, it's an older like system, like for heating or cooling, that doesn't really perform as well as you want it to, and so people are uncomfortable.
Yep, or these, old windows are drafty, or they create cold convection currents near it where you feel cold drafts just because on a winter day.
Yeah, you can pump as much heat in there as you want, but people are still going to be cold.
Exactly.
So
still
you're
feel
going to
uncomfortable.
keep turning the temperature up, which is just not what you really want people to be doing.
Right. So all of the quality of life upgrades really make doing more sustainable work a good, like, why you should do it, because people will benefit in the end.
Exactly. It's sort of, there's direct benefit, like, to the occupants and users of that building, the indirect benefit to everyone else, because, we're helping to reduce carbon usage and trying to address, the very large proportion of emissions that buildings in the built environment are, in terms of total carbon emissions in the world.
Do you think it's better for buildings to start from scratch rather than renovating it, new construction in terms of, or doing new construction in terms of saving energy and time, money, all of the different factors that go into renovating or building a new building?
There was a study that was done, it's probably almost 20 years ago now, honestly, that the National Trust for Historic Preservation put out. And it basically stated that it takes 80 years to make up for all the carbon that went into building a LEED Platinum building. So, in our opinion, always begin with what can you save, right? In terms of thinking about sustainability from a purely like environmental standpoint. The other aspect of it is that, our built environment is part of our culture, right? It's part of who we are. It's a statement of, the values of the community. Not everyone likes the way some of the buildings look. Totally get it. We're moving into the era of preserving brutalist buildings, which are not on everyone's favorite wish list, right? But it's not really about even the aesthetics so much as the fact that, again, what you see out your window, right? The environment you interact in, it's part of who we all are, like collectively as a society and a community. So, you were saying, Megan, earlier, like, what do you value, right? Do you just value a buck or do you value more than that? Mm-hmm. So we like to say that, there's the environmental side of sustainability, there's the cultural side of sustainability as well at the same time.
Yeah. And the topic of embodied carbon that you just brought up, I don't think that can be overstated, the importance of it, because if you look at the lifespan of a building for 50 years, right, and it's putting out so much carbon over its lifespan with operational carbon, that carbon will take effect to the environment, over the next 50 years, but the embodied carbon, the amount of carbon that's going into building it today, that takes effect today, and that will affect all of our goals of, keeping global warming under this 1.5 degrees Celsius and things like that. Like that is, we got upfront carbon, like it is now, carbon now. And so it matters almost tremendously more than the operational carbon that will be spread out over the next 50, 80, 100 years.
Right. Rebecca, you kind of mentioned a little bit about the aesthetics of buildings and brutalism as an example of one that maybe people don't like, but do you think, or how do you think that different architectural styles lend themselves to preservation projects? Is it worth preserving these brutalist buildings right now because it has been so many years since they've been built? They're basically historic,
I think the question of what is historic, right, and what is worth preservation is again, it's like a bigger societal question. But I will say, from a question of embodied carbon, it does not get any more obvious that we need to figure out a way to work with these buildings than looking at them, because the production of Portland cement is so carbon intensive. I'm super excited that we have all kinds of new processes that are out there right now and that we may be moving away from that, right? But when these buildings were built in the 1960s and 1970s, an enormous amount of carbon was expended to get this concrete in place. So I think it behooves us as a society to figure out how to work with these buildings. And also, I think that there is an educational piece involved. The project we're working on right now at University of Massachusetts Dartmouth for the LARTS building that we're working on with Sasaki, these buildings are so architecturally complex and interesting, and I think we need to find a way to explain and or get the public involved in kind of understanding the ideas behind some of these buildings. Because if you actually begin to understand that, I think that will kind of start to change the conversation too, around how they're used. For instance, like we have university administrators who, many of whom probably originally, frankly, and some of them have said it when they came to campus, sort of said, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? But they have kind of grown to really appreciate the ideas and the concepts and the spatial complexities of some of these buildings. So I think we have work to do as architects. And, some of that may actually begin with starting the conversation of like, okay, we get it. Nobody likes concrete except architects. Let's have a frank and open conversation about why this building is good and just be able to kind of like open that dialogue a little bit more.
How do you think clients and architects know how much to care about how much carbon their building is emitting during construction, and other phases before and after?
I think what the profession is kind of engaged in at the moment is a big educational effort, right? We have spent last couple of decades like building tools even, right, to measure this and to really be able to quantify things. There's been efforts by industry to create, not even just by industry, I should say, there's been efforts by a lot of outside groups to create certifications and
benchmarking too.
yes, benchmarking, exactly, to try to really understand the data, right? Because if you don't, we're in a world where everybody wants the numbers, right? They want real, actionable information and data. They want it yesterday. But the good news is, again, over the past couple of decades, there's been a lot of advocacy groups, there's been governmental organizations, there's been industry groups that have developed means and methods for understanding like the environmental impact of different materials, of different processes, right? Of construction means and methods, like all these things. And then they've worked to create tools that take that information in and can actually tell you, right? Like what is the impact if you make one decision versus the other? Like when we did that big effort for the Jones Library, right? The embodied carbon analysis, that's really what you were doing. It's getting that information to the owner, right? About, okay, this is what you are saving by doing this preservation and renovation rather than going off and building a new like 70,000 square foot library.
Yeah, exactly. And we're starting to see it potentially, I guess, become part of our zoning laws. And maybe eventually it will get embedded in energy codes and things like that. So, I think it's coming from both ways, the education side, people who are advocating for it, and then also from policy.
Right. It's probably the only way you can change it if someone's forcing you to do it by law.
It has to, I think it has to come from both directions, right? So at the grassroots, you get a groundswell of people who want to address a problem, right? And then they get information and they bring that up, right, to the policymakers. And then at some point, hopefully, right, there's a change from the policymakers. But the trick is not everybody will have been involved in that grassroots as a society, right? So then the question is, how do we persuade, how do we advocate, how do we educate the folks who are not already kind of in the set of people who understand the issues? And so I think having these tools is like, that's the way we can educate and advocate, right? And get the information out there so that people have it and they can see it for themselves and they can understand and make better decisions, right? About how they're moving forward with projects.
Thank you for listening to What's the Scope with Finegold Alexander Architects. If you want to learn more about the firm, you can visit us at faainc.com. Come back next week for our final episode of this mini-series all about preservation. This is Madison Mercado, and thanks for listening.